Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 46, Angkor the Magnificent and Sri Vijaya, May 17th, 1932. We shall now pay a brief visit to Father India, the colonies and settlements of people from South India in Malaysia and Indo-China. I have already told you how these settlements were deliberately organized and arranged. They did not just grow up anyhow. There must have been frequent journeys across the seas and a sufficient mastery over the seas to permit of this deliberate colonization simultaneously at several places. I have also told you that these colonies began in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Christian era. They were Hindu colonies bearing South Indian names. After some centuries, Buddhism gradually spread, till nearly the whole of Hindu Malaysia had become Buddhist. Let us go to Indo-China first. The earliest colony was named Champa and was in Annam. There we find in the 3rd century the city of Pandurangam growing up. 200 years later, the great city of Cambodia flourished. It was full of great buildings and temples of stone. All over these Indian colonies, you will find mighty buildings growing up. Architects and master builders must have been taken across from India, and they carried on the Indian traditions in building there. Between the different states and islands, there was a great deal of competition in building, and this competition resulted in a high type of artistic development. The people living in these settlements were naturally seafaring folk. They or their ancestors had already crossed the seas to reach these places, and all round them was the sea. Seafaring folk take to trade easily. So these people were traders and merchants, carrying their wares across the seas to the different islands, to India in the west and to China in the east. The different states in Malaysia were thus controlled largely by the merchant classes. Often there was conflict between these states and great wars and massacres. Sometimes a Hindu state waged war against a Buddhist state. But the real motive for many of these wars in those days seems to have been trade rivalry. Just as in these days, wars take place between great powers for markets for the goods they manufacture. For 300 years or so, up to the 8th century, there were 3 different Hindu states in Indo-China. In the 9th century, a great ruler arose, Jayavarman, who united all these and built up a great empire. He was probably a Buddhist. He began building his capital at Angkor, and his successor, Yasovarman, completed it. This Cambodian empire lasted for nearly 400 years. As empires go, it was supposed to be splendid and powerful. The royal city of Angkor Thom was known all over the East as Angkor the Magnificent. It was a city of over 1 million people, larger than the Rome of the Caesars had been. Near it was the wonderful temple of Angkor Wat. In the 13th century, Cambodia was attacked on several sides. The Annamese attacked in the east, the local tribes in the west, and in the north, the Shan people were driven south by Mongols, and finding no other way of escape, they attacked Cambodia. The kingdom was tired out by this constant fighting and defending itself. Still, the city of Angkor continued to be one of the most splendid cities in the East. In 1297, a Chinese envoy who had been sent to the Cambodian king wrote a glowing description of its wonderful buildings. But suddenly, Angkor suffered a terrible catastrophe. About 1300 AC, the mouth of the river Mekong became blocked by deposits of mud. The waters of the river could not flow through, and they backed up and flooded the entire region round the great city, turning fertile fields into a great area of useless marshlands. The large population of the city began to starve. It could not stay on and was forced to leave the city and migrate. So Angkor the Magnificent was abandoned, and the jungle came and took possession of it. And its wonderful buildings housed wild animals for a while, till the jungle reduced the palaces to dust and reigned unchallenged. The Cambodian state could not survive this catastrophe for long. It collapsed gradually and became a province, sometimes ruled by Siam, sometimes by Annam. But even now the ruins of the great temple of Angkor Wat tell us something of the days when a proud and splendid city stood nearby, drawing merchants with their wares from distant lands, sending out to other countries the fine goods that its citizens and artisans made. Across the sea, not very far from Indo-China, lay the island of Sumatra. Here also, the Pallavas from South India had established their earliest colonies in the 1st or 2nd century after Christ. These grew gradually. The Malay Peninsula early became part of the Sumatran state, and for long afterwards, the histories of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula were closely allied. The capital of the state was the large city of Sri Vijaya, situated inland in the mountains of Sumatra and having a port at the mouth of the Palembang River. About the 5th or 6th century, Buddhism became the predominant religion of Sumatra. Indeed, Sumatra took the lead in carrying on active missionary work for Buddhism and ultimately succeeded in converting most of Hindu Malaysia to Buddhism. This Sumatran empire is therefore known as the Buddhist Empire of Sri Vijaya. Sri Vijaya went on growing bigger and bigger till it included not only Sumatra and Malay, but Borneo, Philippines, Celebes, half of Java, half of the island of Formosa, which belongs to Japan now, Ceylon, and even a port in the south of China near Canton. Probably it also included a port in the southern tip of India facing Ceylon. You will thus see that it was a widespread empire, covering the whole of Malaysia. Commerce and trade and shipbuilding were the chief occupations of these Indian colonies. The Chinese and Arabian writers of the time give us long lists of ports and new colonies subject to the Sumatran state. These lists go on growing. The British Empire today is spread out all over the world, and everywhere it has got seaports and good coaling stations. Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, which is largely under British control, Aden, Colombo, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. The British have been a nation of traders during the last 300 years, and their trade and strength have depended on sea power. They have thus required ports and coaling stations at convenient distances all over the world. The Sri Vijaya Empire was also a sea power based on trade. Hence you find that it had ports wherever it could get the smallest footing. Indeed, a remarkable feature of the settlements of the Sumatran state was their strategic value. That is to say, they were carefully located at places where they could command the surrounding seas. Often, they were in pairs to help each other in maintaining this command. Thus, Singapore, which is a great city now, was originally a settlement of the Sumatran colonists. The name, as you will notice, is a typical Indian name, Singapore. The Sumatran people had another settlement just opposite the straits, facing Singapore. Sometimes they would stretch an iron chain right across the strait and so stop all ships from passing till they paid heavy tolls. So the empire of Sri Vijaya was not unlike the British Empire, though of course it was much smaller. But it lasted longer than the British Empire is likely to last. Its period of highest development was in the 11th century, just about the time when the Chola Empire flourished in South India. But it long outlived this Chola Empire. There were friendly relations between the two for a long time, but both were aggressive seafaring folk with strong navies and widespread trade connections. Early in the 11th century, they came into conflict and there was war. The Chola king, Rajendra I, sent an overseas expedition which humbled Sri Vijaya. But Sri Vijaya soon recovered from this shock. At the beginning of the 11th century, the Chinese emperor sent a gift of a number of bronze bells to the Sumatran king. In return, the latter sent pearls and ivory and Sanskrit books. There was also a letter inscribed on a golden plate in Indian characters, it is said. Sri Vijaya flourished for quite a long time, from its early beginnings about the 2nd century to the 5th or 6th century when it turned Buddhist, and then gradual and continuous growth till the 11th century. For another 300 years, it remained a great empire controlling the trade and commerce of Malaysia. It was overthrown ultimately in 1377 AC by another of the old Pallava colonies. I have told you that the Sri Vijaya Empire spread from Ceylon to Canton in China. It included most of the islands in between. But one little bit it could not subdue. This was the eastern part of Java, which continued to remain an independent state and which also remained Hindu and refused to turn Buddhist. Thus, while Western Java was under Sri Vijaya, Eastern Java was independent. This Hindu state of East Java was also a commercial state, and it depended for its prosperity on trade. It must have looked with envious eyes on Singapore, which, because of its fine position, had become a great trade center. Thus, there was rivalry between Sri Vijaya and East Java, and this developed into bitter enmity. From the 12th century onwards, the Javan state grew slowly at the expense of Sri Vijaya, and, as I have said, in the 14th century, in 1377 AC, it defeated Sri Vijaya completely. It was a cruel war, and there was great destruction. Both the cities of Sri Vijaya and Singapore were destroyed. Thus ended the second of the great empires of Malaysia, the Empire of Sri Vijaya, and over its ruins rose the third of these empires, that of Majapahit. In spite of the cruelty and barbarity shown by the East Javans in their war with Sri Vijaya, it appears from the many books we still have of that period in Java that this Hindu state had attained a high degree of civilization. What it excelled in was building, and especially the building of temples. There were over 500 temples, and among these are said to be some of the world's finest and most artistic specimens of stone architecture. Most of these great temples were built between the middle of the 7th and the middle of the 10th century, that is, between 650 and 950 AC. The Javanese must have brought large numbers of builders and master craftsmen from India and other neighboring countries to help them to build these mighty temples. We shall follow the fortunes of Java and Majapahit in a subsequent letter. I might mention here that both Borneo and the Philippines learnt the art of writing from India through these early Pallavan colonies. Unfortunately, many of the old manuscripts in the Philippines were destroyed by the Spaniards. Remember also that the Arabs had their colonies all over these islands from the early days, long before Islam. They were great traders, and wherever trade was to be found, the Arabs went. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 47, Rome Relapses into Darkness, May 1932. I feel often enough that I am not at all a good guide for you through the maze of past history. I get lost myself. How then can I guide you aright? But again, I think that perhaps I might be of a little help to you, and so I continue these letters. To me, certainly, they are of great help. As I write them and think of you, my dear, I forget that the temperature in the shade and where I sit is 112 degrees, and the hot loo is blowing. And I forget even sometimes that I am in the district jail of Bareilly. My last letter carried you right up to the end of the 14th century in Malaysia. And yet, in northern India, we have not gone beyond King Harsha's time, the 7th century. And in Europe, we have still more time to make up. It is very difficult to keep to the same time scale everywhere. I try to do so, but sometimes, as in the case of Angkor and Sri Vijaya, I shoot ahead a few hundred years, so that I might complete their story. But remember that while the Cambodian Empire and the Sri Vijaya Empire flourished in the East, all manner of changes were taking place in India and in China and in Europe. Remember also that my last letter contains, in a few pages, the history of 1,000 years of Indo-China and Malaysia. These countries are cut off from the main currents of Asiatic and European history, and therefore little attention is paid to them. But theirs is a rich and long history, rich in achievement, in trade, in art, in architecture especially, and it is well worthy of study. To Indians, their story must be of particular interest, for they were almost a part of India. Men and women from India crossing the eastern seas and carrying with them Indian culture and civilization and art and religion. So, although we have gone on ahead in Malaysia, we are really still in the 7th century. We have still to go to Arabia and consider the coming of Islam and the great changes that this brought in Europe and Asia. And we have to follow the course of events in Europe. Let us have another look at Europe, and let us go back a little. You will remember that Constantine, the Roman emperor, founded the city of Constantinople, where Byzantium was, on the shores of the Bosphorus. To this city, the new Rome, he shifted the capital of the empire from the old Rome. Soon afterwards, the Roman Empire split up into two: the Western, with Rome for its capital, and the Eastern Empire with its seat at Constantinople. The Eastern Empire had to face great difficulties and many enemies. And yet, strange to say, it managed to carry on century after century for 1,100 years till the Turks put an end to it. The Western Empire had no such existence. In spite of the great prestige of the Roman name and the imperial city of Rome, which had for so long dominated the Western world, it collapsed with remarkable rapidity. It could not withstand the attacks of any of the northern tribes. Alaric, the Goth, marched down into Italy and captured Rome in 410 AC. Later came the Vandals, who also sacked Rome. The Vandals were a Germanic people who had crossed France and Spain and entering Africa had established a kingdom on the ruins of Carthage. From old Carthage, they crossed the seas and captured Rome. It seems almost as though it were a belated revenge for the Roman victory in the Punic Wars. About this time, the Huns, who had originally come from Central Asia or Mongolia, became powerful. These people were nomads. They had settled down east of the Danube River and north and west of the Eastern Roman Empire. Under Attila, their leader, they became very aggressive, and the Constantinople emperor and government lived in constant terror of them. Attila bullied them and made them pay large sums of money to him. Having humiliated the Eastern Empire sufficiently, Attila decided to attack the Western Empire. He invaded Gaul and destroyed many towns in southern France. The imperial forces would have been no match for him. But the Germanic tribes, the barbarians of the Romans, were frightened at this Hun invasion, and so the Franks and Goths joined the imperial army, and together they fought the Huns under Attila at a great battle at Troyes. Over 150,000 people are said to have been killed at this battle, at which Attila was defeated and the Mongolian Huns repulsed. This was in 451 AC. But Attila, though defeated, was full of fight. He went down to Italy and burnt and looted many towns in the north. He died soon afterwards, leaving an enduring reputation for cruelty and ruthlessness. Attila the Hun is even today almost the embodiment of ruthless destruction. The Huns quietened down after his death and settled on the land and got mixed up with many other populations. You may remember that it was roughly about this time that the White Huns came to India. 40 years later, a Goth, Theodoric, became king of Rome, and that was almost the end of the Western Empire. A successful attempt was made a little later by an Eastern emperor, Justinian, to include Italy in his empire. He conquered both Italy and Sicily, but they broke away soon after, and the Eastern Empire had enough to do to protect itself. Is it not strange that Imperial Rome and her empire should have collapsed so quickly and so easily before almost every tribe that chose to attack it? One would think that Rome had gone to pieces, or that it was just a hollow shell. Probably this would be correct. The strength of Rome for a lengthy period lay in her prestige. Her past history had led other peoples to think of her as the leader of the world, and they treated her with respect and almost with superstitious fear. So Rome continued outwardly as the powerful mistress of an empire, but in reality with no strength behind her. There was outward calm, and there were crowds in her theaters and stadiums and marketplaces. But inevitably, she was heading for collapse, not merely because she was weak, but because she had built up a rich man's civilization on the misery and slavery of the masses. I told you in one of my letters of the revolts and insurrections of the poor, also of a great slaves' revolt which was ruthlessly put down. These revolts show us how rotten was the social structure of Rome. It was going to pieces of itself, and the coming of the northern tribes, the Goths and the others, helped this process, and therefore they met with little opposition. The Roman peasant was fed up with his miserable lot and welcomed any change. As for the poor laborer and the slave, they were far worse off. With the end of the Western Roman Empire, we see the new peoples of the West coming to the front. the Goths and Franks and others, with whose names I shall not trouble you. These peoples are the ancestors of the Western Europeans of today, the Germans, French, etc. Slowly we see these countries taking shape in Europe. At the same time, we find a very low type of civilization. The end of imperial Rome had also been the end of the pomp and luxury of Rome, and the superficial civilization which had dragged on in Rome vanished almost in a day, its roots having long been sapped. Thus we see actually one of the strange instances of humanity visibly moving backwards. We have this in India, in Egypt, in China, in Greece and Rome and elsewhere. After knowledge and experience have been laboriously gathered and a culture and civilization built up, there is a stop. And not only a stop, but a going back. A veil seems to be cast over the past, and though we have occasional glimpses of it, the mountain of knowledge and experience has to be climbed afresh. Perhaps each time one goes a little higher and makes the next ascent easier. Just as expedition after expedition goes up Mount Everest, each subsequent expedition goes nearer to the summit. And it may be that the highest peak will be conquered before long. So we find darkness in Europe. The Dark Ages begin, and life becomes rude and crude, and there is almost no education, and fighting seems to be the only occupation or amusement. The days of Socrates and Plato seem very far off indeed. So much for the West. Let us look at the Eastern Empire also. Constantine, you will remember, made Christianity the official religion. One of his successors, the Emperor Julian, refused to accept Christianity. He wanted to go back to the worship of the old gods and goddesses. But he could not succeed, for the old gods had had their day, and Christianity was too powerful for them. Julian was called Julian the Apostate by the Christians, and that is the title by which he is known in history. Soon after Julian came another emperor who was very unlike him. His name was Theodosius, and he is called the Great. I suppose because he was great in destroying the old temples and the old statues of the gods and goddesses. He was not only strongly opposed to those who were not Christians, he was equally aggressive against Christians who were not orthodox, according to his way of thinking. He would tolerate no opinion or religion of which he did not approve. Theodosius, for a short while, joined the Eastern and Western empires and was emperor of both. This was in 392 AC. Before the barbarian invasions of Rome. Christianity continued to spread. Its struggles now were not against non-Christians. All the fighting was done by Christian sects against each other, and the amount of intolerance shown by them is amazing. All over Northern Africa and Western Asia, as well as in Europe, there were many battlegrounds where Christians sought to convince their brother Christians of the true faith by means of blows and cudgels and such like gentle measures of persuasion. From 527 to 565 AC, Justinian was emperor at Constantinople. As I have already told you, he turned out the Goths from Italy, and for some time, Italy and Sicily were parts of the Eastern Empire. Later, the Goths recovered Italy. Justinian built the beautiful cathedral of Sancta Sophia in Constantinople, which is still one of the finest of Byzantine churches. He also had all the existing laws brought together and arranged by able lawyers. Long before I knew anything of the Eastern Roman Empire and its emperors, I knew of Justinian's name from this law book, which is called the Institutes of Justinian, and which I had to read. But although Justinian founded a university at Constantinople, he closed the academy or the old schools of philosophy of Athens, which had been founded by Plato and had lasted 1,000 years. Philosophy is a dangerous thing for any dogmatic religion. It makes people think. And so we have arrived at the 6th century. We see Rome and Constantinople gradually drifting farther apart. Rome taken possession of by the Germanic tribes of the north. Constantinople becoming the center of a Greek empire, although it was called Roman. Rome going to pieces and sinking to the low level of civilization of its conquerors, whom it used to call the barbarians in the days of its glory. Constantinople carrying on the old tradition in a way, but also going down in the scale of civilization. Christian sects fighting each other for mastery, and Eastern Christianity, which had spread right up to Turkestan and China and Abyssinia, becoming cut off from both Constantinople and Rome. The Dark Ages commence. Learning, so far, was classical learning, that is, Greek or Old Latin, which derived its inspiration from Greek. But these old Greek books, dealing with gods and goddesses and with philosophies, were not considered to be fit literature for the pious and devout and intolerant Christians of those early days. So they were not encouraged, and learning suffered, as did also many forms of art. But Christianity did something also to preserve learning and art. Monasteries like the Buddhist Sangha were founded and spread rapidly. In these monasteries, sometimes the old learning found a home. And here also the beginnings of a new art were laid down, which was to blossom forth in all its beauty many centuries later. These monks just managed to keep the lamp of learning and art burning dimly. It was a service they rendered by preventing it from going out. But the light was confined to a narrow place. Outside, there was general darkness. In these early days of Christianity, there was another strange tendency. Many people, fired by religious zeal, retired into the deserts and solitary places, far from the haunts of man, and lived in a wild state there. They tortured themselves and did not wash at all, and generally tried to bear as much pain as possible. This was especially so in Egypt, where many such hermits lived in the desert. Their idea seems to have been that the more they suffered and the less they washed, the holier they became. One of these hermits sat on the top of a column for many years. These hermits gradually ceased to exist, but for a long time, many devout Christians believed that to enjoy anything was almost a sin. This idea of suffering colored the Christian mentality. There is not much of this in Europe today. Indeed, everybody there seems bent on rushing about madly and having what is called a good time. And the rushing about often ends in weariness and ennui, and not in the good time. But in India, we see sometimes even today, people behaving to some extent as the Christian hermits did in Egypt. They hold up one arm till it dries up and atrophies, or sit on spikes, or do many other absurd and foolish things. Some do it, I suppose, just to impose on ignorant people and get money out of them. Others, perhaps because they feel that they become more holy thereby. As if it can ever be desirable to make your body unfit for any decent activity. I am reminded of a story of Buddha, for which again I go to our old friend Huan Sang. A young disciple of his was doing penance. Buddha asked him, "You, dear youth, when living as a layman, did you know how to play the lute?" He said, "I knew." "Well then," said Buddha, "I will draw a comparison derived from this. The chords being too tight, then the sounds were not in cadence. When they were too loose, then the sounds had neither harmony nor charm. But when not tight and not slack, then the sounds were harmonious. So also," Buddha continued, "in regard to the body. If it is harshly treated, it becomes wearied, and the mind is listless. If it is too softly treated, then the feelings are pampered, and the will is weakened." Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 48, The Coming of Islam. May 21st, 1932. We have considered the history of many countries and the ups and downs of many kingdoms and empires. But Arabia has not yet come into our story, except as a country which sent out mariners and traders to distant parts of the world. Look at the map. To the west is Egypt, to the north, Syria and Iraq, and a little to the east of this, Persia or Iran. A little farther to the northwest are Asia Minor and Constantinople. Greece is not far, and India also is just across the sea on the other side. Except for China and the Far East, Arabia was very centrally situated so far as the old civilizations were concerned. Great cities rose on the Tigris and Euphrates in Iraq, Alexandria in Egypt, Damascus in Syria, Antioch in Asia Minor. The Arab was a traveler and a trader, and he must have gone to these cities frequently enough. But still, Arabia plays no notable part in history. There does not seem to be as high a degree of civilization there as in neighboring countries. It neither attempted to conquer other countries, nor was it easy to subdue it. Arabia is a desert country, and deserts and mountains breed hard people who love their freedom and are not easily subdued. It was not a rich country, and there was little in it to attract foreign conquerors and imperialists. There were just two little towns, Mecca and Yathrib by the sea. For the rest, there were dwellings in the desert, and the people of the country were largely Bedouins or Badus, the dwellers of the desert. Their constant companions were their swift camels and their beautiful horses. And even the ass was a faithful friend, valued for its remarkable powers of endurance. To be compared to the donkey or the ass was a compliment, and not a term of reproach, as in other countries. For life is hard in a desert country, and strength and endurance are even more precious qualities there than elsewhere. They were proud and sensitive, these men of the desert, and quarrelsome. They lived in their clans and their families, and quarreled with other clans and families. Once a year, they made peace with each other and journeyed to Mecca on pilgrimage to their many gods whose images were kept there. Above all, they worshipped a huge black stone, the Kaaba. It was a nomadic and patriarchal life, the kind of life led by the primitive tribes in Central Asia or elsewhere, before they settled down to city life and civilization. The great empires which rose up round Arabia often included Arabia in their dominions. But this was more nominal than real. It was no easy matter to subdue or govern nomadic desert tribes. Once, as you may perhaps remember, a little Arab state rose in Palmyra in Syria, and it had its brief period of glory in the 3rd century after Christ. But even this was outside Arabia proper. So the Bedouins lived their desert lives, generation after generation, and Arab ships went out to trade, and Arabia went on with little change. Some people became Christians, and some became Jews. But mostly, they remained worshippers of the 360 idols and the black stone in Mecca. It is strange that this Arab race, which for long ages had lived a sleepy existence, apparently cut off from what was happening elsewhere, should suddenly wake up and show such tremendous energy as to startle and upset the world. The story of the Arabs and of how they spread rapidly over Asia, Europe, and Africa, and of the high culture and civilization which they developed, is one of the wonders of history. Islam was the new force or idea which woke up the Arabs and filled them with self-confidence and energy. This was a religion started by a new prophet, Muhammad, who was born in Mecca in 570 AC. He was in no hurry to start this religion. He lived a quiet life, liked and trusted by his fellow citizens. Indeed, he was known as Al-Amin, the trusty. But when he started preaching his new religion, and especially when he preached against the idols at Mecca, there was a loud outcry against him. And ultimately, he was driven out of Mecca, barely escaping with his life. Above all, he laid stress on the claim that there was only one God, and that he, Muhammad, was the prophet of God. Driven away by his own people from Mecca, he sought refuge with some friends and helpers in Yathrib. This flight from Mecca is called the Hijrat in Arabic, and the Muslim calendar begins from this date, 622 AC. This Hijra calendar is a lunar calendar. That is, it is calculated according to the moon. It is therefore 5 or 6 days shorter than the solar year which we usually observe. And the Hijra months do not stick to the same seasons of the year. Thus, the same month may be in winter this year and in the middle of summer after some years. Islam may be said to begin with the flight, the Hijrat, in 622 AC, although in a sense it had begun a little earlier. The city of Yathrib welcomed Muhammad, and in honor of his coming, the name of the city itself was changed to Madinat un-Nabi, the city of the Prophet, or just shortly, Medina, or Medina as it is known now. The people of Medina who helped Muhammad were called Ansar, the helpers. Descendants of these helpers were proud of this title, and even to this day they use it. Before we start on Islam's and the Arabs' career of conquest, let us have one look around. We have just seen that Rome had collapsed. The old Greco-Roman civilization had ended, and the whole social structure which it had built up had been upset. The northern European tribes and clans were now coming into some prominence. Trying to learn something from Rome, they were really building up an entirely new type of civilization. But this was just the beginning of it, and there was little of it visible. Thus the old had gone, and the new had not taken its place. So there was darkness in Europe. At the eastern end of it, it is true, there was the Eastern Roman Empire, which still flourished. The city of Constantinople was even then a great and splendid city, the greatest in Europe. Games and circuses took place in its amphitheaters, and there was a great deal of pomp and show. But still the empire was weakening. There were continuous wars with the Sassanids of Persia. Khusrau II of Persia had indeed taken away from Constantinople part of its dominions, and even claimed a nominal overlordship over Arabia. Khusrau also conquered Egypt and went right up to Constantinople, but was then defeated by Heraclius, the Greek emperor there. Later, Khusrau was murdered by his own son, Kavad. So you will notice that both Europe in the west and Persia in the east were in a bad way. Add to this the quarrels of the Christian sects, which had no end. A very corrupt and quarrelsome Christianity flourished in the west as well as in Africa. In Persia, the Zoroastrian religion was part of the state and was forced on the people. So the average person in Europe or Africa or Persia was disillusioned with the existing religion. Just about this time, early in the 7th century, great plagues swept all over Europe, killing millions of people. In India, Harshavardhana ruled, and Huan Sang paid his visit about this time. During Harsha's reign, India was a strong power, but soon after, northern India grew divided and weak. Farther east in China, the great Tang dynasty had just begun its career. In 627 AC, Tai Tsung, one of their greatest emperors, came to the throne, and during his time, the Chinese Empire extended right up to the Caspian Sea in the west. Most of the countries of Central Asia acknowledged his suzerainty and paid tribute to him. Probably there was no centralized government of the whole of this vast empire. This was the state of the Asiatic and European world when Islam was born. China was strong and powerful, but it was far. India was strong enough for a period at least. But we shall see that there was no conflict with India for a long time to come. Europe and Africa was weak and exhausted. Within 7 years of the flight, Muhammad returned to Mecca as its master. Even before this, he sent out from Medina a summons to the kings and rulers of the world to acknowledge the one God and his prophet. Heraclius, the Constantinople emperor, got it while he was still engaged in his campaign against the Persians in Syria. The Persian king got it, and it is said that even Tai Tsung got it in China. They must have wondered, these kings and rulers, who this unknown person was who dared to command them. From the sending of these messages, we can form some idea of the supreme confidence in himself and his mission which Muhammad must have had. And this confidence and faith he managed to give to his people, and with this to inspire and console them. This desert people of no great consequence managed to conquer half the known world. Confidence and faith in themselves were a great thing. Islam also gave them a message of brotherhood, of the equality of all those who were Muslims. A measure of democracy was thus placed before the people. Compared to the corrupt Christianity of the day, this message of brotherhood must have had a great appeal not only for the Arabs, but also for the inhabitants of many countries where they went. Muhammad died in 632 AC, 10 years after the Hijrat. He had succeeded in making a nation out of the many warring tribes of Arabia, and in firing them with enthusiasm for a cause. He was succeeded by Abu Bakr, a member of his family, as Khalifa, or Caliph, or chief. This succession used to be by a kind of informal election at a public meeting. 2 years later, Abu Bakr died and was succeeded by Omar, who was Khalifa for 10 years. Abu Bakr and Omar were great men who laid the foundation of Arabian and Islamic greatness. As Khalifas, they were both religious heads and political chiefs, king and pope in one. In spite of their high position and the growing power of their state, they stuck to the simplicity of their ways and refused to countenance luxury and pomp. The democracy of Islam was a living thing for them. But their own officers and emirs took to silks and luxury soon enough. And many stories are told of Abu Bakr, Omar rebuking and punishing these officers, and even weeping at this extravagance. They felt that their strength lay in their simple and hard living, and that if they took to the luxury of the Persian or Constantinople courts, the Arabs would be corrupted and would fall. Even in these short dozen years, during which Abu Bakr and Umar ruled, the Arabs defeated both the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sassanid king of Persia. Jerusalem, the holy city of the Jews and Christians, was occupied by the Arabs, and the whole of Syria and Iraq and Persia became part of the new Arabian Empire. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 49. The Arabs Conquer from Spain to Mongolia. May 23, 1932. Like the founders of some other religions, Muhammad was a rebel against many of the existing social customs. The religion he preached, by its simplicity and directness, and its flavor of democracy and equality, appealed to the masses in the neighboring countries who had been ground down long enough by autocratic kings and equally autocratic and domineering priests. They were tired of the old order and were ripe for a change. Islam offered them this change, and it was a welcome change, for it bettered them in many ways and put an end to many old abuses. Islam did not bring any great social revolution in its train, which might have put an end to a large extent to the exploitation of the masses. But it did lessen this exploitation so far as the Muslims were concerned, and made them feel that they belonged to one great brotherhood. So the Arabs marched from conquest to conquest. Often enough, they won without fighting. Within 25 years of the death of their prophet, the Arabs conquered the whole of Persia and Syria and Armenia, and a bit of Central Asia on the one side, and Egypt and a bit of northern Africa on the west. Egypt had fallen to them with the greatest ease, as Egypt had suffered most from the exploitation of the Roman Empire and from the rivalry of Christian sects. There is a story that the Arabs burnt the famous library of Alexandria, but this is now believed to be false. The Arabs were too fond of books to behave in this barbarous manner. It is probable, however, that the Emperor Theodosius of Constantinople, about whom I have told you something already, was guilty of this destruction, or part of it. A part of the library had been destroyed long before, during a siege at the time of Julius Caesar. Theodosius did not approve of old pagan Greek books dealing with the old Greek mythologies and philosophies. He was much too devout a Christian. It is said that he used these books as fuel with which to heat his baths. The Arabs went on advancing both in the east and the west. In the east, Herat and Kabul and Balkh fell, and they reached the Indus River and Sindh. But beyond this, they did not go into India, and for several hundred years, their relations with the Indian rulers were of the friendliest. In the west, they marched on and on. It is said that their general, Uqba, went right across northern Africa till he reached the Atlantic Ocean on the western coast of what is now known as Morocco. He was rather disappointed at this obstacle, and he rowed as far as he could into the sea, and then expressed his sorrow to the Almighty that there was no more land in that direction for him to conquer in his name. From Morocco and Africa, the Arabs crossed the narrow sea into Spain and Europe. The Pillars of Hercules, as these narrow straits were called by the old Greeks. The Arab general who crossed into Europe landed at Gibraltar, and this name itself is a reminder of him. His name was Tariq, and Gibraltar is really Jabalut Tariq, the Rock of Tariq. Spain was conquered rapidly, and the Arabs then poured into southern France. So, in about 100 years from the death of Muhammad, the Arab Empire spread from the south of France and Spain right across northern Africa to Suez, and across Arabia and Persia and Central Asia to the borders of Mongolia. India was out of it except for Sindh. Europe was being attacked by the Arabs from two sides, directly at Constantinople and in France via Africa. The Arabs in the south of France were small in numbers, and they were very far from their homeland. Thus, they could not get much help from Arabia, which was busy then conquering Central Asia. But still, these Arabs in France frightened the people of Western Europe, and a great coalition was formed to fight them. Charles Martel was the leader of this coalition, and in 732 AC, he defeated them at the Battle of Tours in France. This defeat saved Europe from the Arabs. On the plains of Tours, a historian has said, the Arabs lost the empire of the world when almost in their grasp. There can be no doubt that if the Arabs had won at Tours, European history would have been tremendously changed. There was no one else to stop them in Europe, and they could have marched right across to Constantinople and put an end to the Eastern Roman Empire and the other states on the way. Instead of Christianity, Islam would then have become the religion of Europe, and all manner of other changes might have taken place. But this is just a flight of imagination. As it happened, the Arabs were stopped in France. For many hundreds of years afterwards, however, they remained and ruled in Spain. From Spain to Mongolia, the Arabs triumphed. And these nomads from the deserts became the proud rulers of a mighty empire. Saracens they were called, perhaps from Sehra and Nashin, the dwellers of the desert. But the dwellers of the desert took soon enough to luxury and city life, and palaces grew up in their cities. In spite of their triumphs in distant countries, they could not get rid of their old habit of quarreling amongst themselves. Of course, there was something worth quarreling about now. For the headship of Arabia meant the control of a great empire. So there were frequent quarrels for the place of the Khalifa. There were petty quarrels, family quarrels, leading to civil war. These quarrels resulted in a big division in Islam, and two sects were formed: the Sunnis and Shias, which still exist. Trouble came soon after the regimes of the first two great Khalifas, Abu Bakr and Omar. Ali, the husband of Fatima, who was the daughter of Muhammad, was Khalifa for a short while. But there was continuous conflict. Ali was murdered, and sometime later, his son Hussein, with his family, were massacred on the plain of Karbala. It is this tragedy of Karbala that is mourned year after year in the month of Muharram by the Muslims, and especially the Shias. The Khalifa now becomes an absolute king. There is nothing of democracy or election left about him. He was just like any other absolute monarch of his day. In theory, he continued to be the religious head also, the commander of the faithful. But some of these rulers actually insulted Islam, of which they were supposed to be the chief protectors. For about 100 years, the Khalifas belonged to a branch of Muhammad's family known as the Umayyads. Damascus was made their capital, and this old city became very beautiful, with its palaces, mosques, fountains, and kiosks. The water supply of Damascus was famous. During this period, the Arabs developed a special style of architecture which has come to be known as Saracenic architecture. There is not much of ornamentation in this. It is simple and imposing and beautiful. The idea behind this architecture was the graceful palm of Arabia and Syria. The arches and the pillars and the minarets and domes remind one of the arching and doming of palm groves. This architecture came to India also, but here it was influenced by Indian ideas and a mixed style was evolved. Some of the finest examples of Saracenic architecture are still in Spain. Wealth and empire brought luxury and the games and arts of luxury. Horse racing was a favorite amusement of the Arabs. So also were polo and hunting and chess. There was quite a fashionable craze for music and especially for singing, and the capital was full of singers with their trains and hangers-on. Another great but very unfortunate change gradually took place. This was in the position of women. Among the Arabs, women did not observe any parda. They were not secluded and hidden away. They moved about in public, went to mosques and lectures, and even delivered lectures. But success made the Arabs imitate more and more the customs of the two old empires on either side of them, the Eastern Roman and the Persian. They had defeated the former and put an end to the latter. But they themselves succumbed to many an evil habit of these empires. It is said that it was due especially to the influence of Constantinople and Persia that the seclusion of women began among the Arabs. Gradually, the harem system begins, and men and women meet each other less and less socially. Unhappily, this seclusion of women became a feature of Islamic society. And India also learnt it from them when the Muslims came here. It amazes me to think that some people put up with this barbarity still. Whenever I think of the women in Parda, cut off from the outside world, I invariably think of a prison or a zoo. How can a nation go ahead if half of its population is kept hidden away in a kind of prison? Fortunately, India is rapidly tearing the parda away. Even Muslim society has largely rid itself of this terrible burden. In Turkey, Kemal Pasha has put an end to it completely. And in Egypt, it is going fast. One thing more, and I shall finish this letter. The Arabs, especially at the beginning of their awakening, were full of enthusiasm for their faith. Yet they were a tolerant people, and there are numerous instances of this toleration in religion. In Jerusalem, the Khalifa Omar made a point of it. In Spain, there was a large Christian population which had the fullest liberty of conscience. In India, the Arabs never ruled except in Sindh. But there were frequent contacts and the relations were friendly. Indeed, the most noticeable thing about this period of history is the contrast between the toleration of the Muslim Arab and the intolerance of the Christian in Europe. Dear friends and students, you are listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Chapter 50, Baghdad and Harun al-Rashid, May 27, 1932. Let us continue the story of the Arabs before reverting to other countries. For nearly 100 years, as I told you in my last letter, the caliphs belonged to the Umayyad branch of the Prophet Muhammad's family. They ruled from Damascus, and during their rule, the Muslim Arabs carried the standard of Islam far and wide. While the Arabs conquered in distant lands, they quarreled at home, and there was frequent civil war. Ultimately, the Umayyads were overthrown by another branch of Muhammad's family, descended from his uncle Abbas, and hence called the Abbasides. The Abbasides came as avengers of the cruelties of the Umayyads, but they excelled them in cruelty and massacre after their victory was won. They hunted out all the Umayyads they could find and killed them in a barbarous way. This was the beginning in 750 AC of the long reign of the Abbasid caliphs. It was not a very happy or auspicious beginning, and yet the Abbasid period is a bright enough period in Arab history. But there were great changes now from the days of the Umayyads. The civil war in Arabia shook up the whole of the Arab Empire. The Abbasides won at home, but in far Spain, the Arab governor was an Umayyad, and he refused to recognize the Abbasid caliph. North Africa, or the viceroyalty of Ifriqiya as it was called, also became more or less independent soon afterwards. And Egypt did likewise, and indeed went so far as to proclaim another caliph. Egypt was near enough to be threatened and forced to submit, and this was done from time to time. But Ifriqiya was not interfered with, and as for Spain, it was much too far away for any action. So we see that the Arab Empire split up on the accession of the Abbasides. The caliph was no longer the head of the whole Muslim world. He was not now the commander of all the faithful. Islam was no longer united, and the Arabs in Spain and the Abbasides disliked each other so much that each often welcomed the misfortunes of the other. In spite of all this, the Abbasid caliphs were great sovereigns, and their empire was a great empire, as empires go. The old faith and energy which conquered mountains and spread like a prairie fire were no more in evidence. There was no simplicity and little of democracy left, and the commander of the faithful was little different from the Persian king of kings, who had been defeated by the earlier Arabs. or the emperor at Constantinople. In the Arabs of the time of Muhammad the Prophet, there was a strange life and strength which were very different from the strength of kings' armies. They stood out in the world of their time, and armies and princes crumpled up before their irresistible march. The masses were wary of these princes, and the Arabs seemed to bring to them the promise of change for the better and of social revolution. All this was changed now. The men of the desert lived in palaces now, and instead of dates had the most gorgeous foods. They were comfortable enough, so why should they bother about change and social revolution? They tried to rival the old empires in splendor, and they adopted many an evil custom of theirs. One of these, as I told you, was the seclusion of women. The capital now went from Damascus to Baghdad in Iraq. This change of capital itself was significant. For Baghdad used to be the summer retreat of the Persian kings. And as Baghdad was farther away from Europe than Damascus, henceforth the Abbasides looked more towards Asia than to Europe. There were to be still many attempts to capture Constantinople, and there were many wars with European nations. But most of these wars were defensive. The days of conquest seemed to have ended, and the Abbasid caliphs tried to consolidate such of the empire as was left to them. This was great enough even without Spain and Africa. Baghdad. Do you not remember it? And Harun al-Rashid? And Scheherazade? And the wonderful stories contained in the Arabian Nights? The city that now grew up under the Abbasid caliphs was the city of the Arabian Nights. It was a vast city of palaces and public offices and schools and colleges, and great shops and parks and gardens. The merchants carried on a vast trade with the East and West. Crowds of government officials kept in continuous touch with the distant parts of the empire, and the government, becoming more and more complicated, was divided up into many departments. An efficient postal system connected all the corners of the empire to the capital. Hospitals abounded. Visitors came to Baghdad from all over the world, especially learned men and students and artists. For it was known that the caliph welcomed all who were learned or who were skillful in the arts. The caliph himself lived in great luxury, surrounded by slaves, and his womenfolk had taken to the harem. The Abbasid Empire was at the height of its outward glory during the reign of Harun al-Rashid, from 786 to 809 AC. Embassies came to Harun from the Emperor of China and Emperor Charlemagne in the west. Baghdad and the Abbasid dominions were far in advance of the Europe of those days, except for Arab Spain, in all the arts of government, in trade, and in the development of learning. The Abbasid period is especially interesting for us because of the new interest in science which it started. Science, as you know, is a very big thing in the modern world, and we owe a great deal to it. Science does not simply sit down and pray for things to happen, but seeks to find out why things happen. It experiments and tries again and again, and sometimes fails and sometimes succeeds. And so bit by bit, it adds to human knowledge. This modern world of ours is very different from the ancient world or the Middle Ages. This great difference is largely due to science. for the modern world has been made by science. Among the ancients, we do not find the scientific method in Egypt or China or India. We find just a bit of it in old Greece. In Rome again, it was absent. But the Arabs had this scientific spirit of inquiry, and so they may be considered the fathers of modern science. In some subjects, like medicine and mathematics, they learnt much from India. Indian scholars and mathematicians came in large numbers to Baghdad. Many Arab students went to Takshashila in North India, which was still a great university, specializing in medicine. Sanskrit books on medical and other subjects were especially translated into Arabic. Many things, for example paper making, the Arabs learnt from China. But on the basis of the knowledge gained from others, they made their own researches and made several important discoveries. They made the first telescope and the mariner's compass. In medicine, Arab physicians and surgeons were famous all over Europe. Baghdad was, of course, the great center of all these intellectual activities. In the west, Córdoba, the capital of Arab Spain, was another center. There were many other university centers in the Arab world, where the life of the intellect flourished. There was Cairo, or Al-Qahira, the victorious, Basra, and Kufa. But over all these famous cities towered Baghdad, the capital of Islam, the eye of Iraq, the seat of empire, the center of beauty, culture, and arts, as an Arab historian describes it. It had a population of over 2 million, and thus was far bigger than modern Calcutta or Bombay. It may interest you to know that the habit of wearing socks and stockings is said to have begun in Baghdad among the rich. They were called mozas, and the Hindustani word for them must be derived from this. So also the French chemise, which comes from kameez, a shirt. Both the kameez and the moza went from the Arabs to the Byzantines in Constantinople, and from there to Europe. The Arabs reached the borders of India soon enough, even while Harsha was alive. They stopped there for a while and then took possession of Sindh. In 710 AC, a young boy of 17, Muhammad ibn Qasim, commanding an Arab army, conquered the Indus Valley up to Multan in western Punjab. This was the full extent of the Arab conquest of India. Perhaps if they had tried hard enough, they might have gone farther. It should not have been difficult, as North India was weak. But, although there was plenty of fighting going on between these Arabs and the neighboring rulers, there was no organized attempt at conquest. Politically, therefore, this Arab conquest of Sindh was not an important affair. The Muslim conquest of India was to come several hundred years later. But culturally, the contact of the Arabs with the people of India had great results. The Arabs had friendly relations with the Indian rulers of the south, especially the Rashtrakutas. Many Arabs settled along the west coast of India and built mosques in their settlements. Arab travelers and traders visited various parts of India. Arab students came in large numbers to the Northern University of Takshashila or Taxila, which was especially famous for medicine. It is said that in the days of Harun al-Rashid, Indian scholarship had a high place in Baghdad, and physicians from India went there to organize hospitals and medical schools. Many Sanskrit books on mathematics and astronomy were translated into Arabic. Thus, the Arabs took much from the old Indo-Aryan culture. They took also much from the Aryan culture of Persia and also something from Hellenic culture. They were almost like a new race, in the prime of their vigor, and they took advantage of all the old cultures they saw around them and learnt from them. And on this foundation, they built something of their very own, the Saracenic culture. This had a comparatively brief life as cultures go, but it was a brilliant life, which shines against the dark background of the Middle Ages in Europe. It is strange to find that while the Arabs profited by their contacts with Indo-Aryan, Persian, and Hellenic cultures, the Indians and Persians and Greeks did not profit much by their contacts with the Arabs. Perhaps this was due to the fact that the Arabs were new and full of vigor and enthusiasm, while the others were old races, going along the old ruts and not caring overmuch for change. It is curious how age seems to have the same effect on a people or a race as it has on an individual. It makes them slow of movement, inelastic in mind and body, conservative, and afraid of change. So India was not greatly affected or much changed by this contact with the Arabs, which lasted for some hundreds of years. But during this long period, India must have got to know something of the new religion, Islam. Muslim Arabs came and went and built mosques, and sometimes preached their religion, and sometimes even converted people. There seems to have been no objection to this in those days. No trouble or friction between Hinduism and Islam. It is interesting to note this because in later days, friction and trouble did arise between the two religions. It was only when in the 11th century, Islam came to India in the guise of a conqueror, sword in hand, that it produced a violent reaction, and the old toleration gave way to hatred and conflict. This wielder of the sword who came to India with fire and slaughter was Mahmud of Ghazni. Ghazni is now a little town in Afghanistan. Round about Ghazni grew up a state in the 10th century. Nominally, the Central Asian states were under the Caliph of Baghdad. But, as I have told you already, after Harun al-Rashid's death, the Caliph weakened and a time came when his empire split up into a number of independent states. This is the period of which we are now speaking. A Turkish slave named Subuktagin carved a state for himself around Ghazni and Kandahar about 975 AC. He raided India also. In those days, a man named Jaipal was Raja of Lahore. Very venturesome, Jaipal marched to the Kabul valley against Subuktagin and got defeated. Mahmud succeeded his father Subuktagin. He was a brilliant general and a fine cavalry leader. Year after year, he raided India and sacked and killed and took away with him vast treasure and large numbers of captives. Altogether, he made 17 raids, and only one of these, into Kashmir, was a failure. The others were successful, and he became a terror all over the north. He went as far south as Patliputra, Mathura, and Somnath. From Thaneshwara, he took away, it is said, 200,000 captives and vast wealth. But it was in Somnath that he got the most treasure. For this was one of the great temples, and the offerings of centuries had accumulated there. It is said that thousands of people took refuge in the temple when Mahmud approached, in the hope that a miracle would happen and the god they worshipped would protect them. But miracles seldom occur, except in the imaginations of the faithful, and the temple was broken and looted by Mahmud, and 50,000 people perished, waiting for the miracle which did not happen. Mahmud died in 1030 AC. The whole of the Punjab and Sindh was under his sway at the time. He is looked upon as a great leader of Islam who came to spread Islam in India. Most Muslims adore him. Most Hindus hate him. As a matter of fact, he was hardly a religious man. He was a Mohammedan, of course, but that was by the way. Above everything, he was a soldier, and a brilliant soldier. He came to India to conquer and loot, as soldiers unfortunately do. And he would have done so to whatever religion he might have belonged. It is interesting to find that he threatened the Muslim rulers of Sindh, and only on their submission and payment of tribute did he spare them. He even threatened the Caliph at Baghdad with death and demanded Samarkand from him. We must therefore not fall into the common error of considering Mahmud anything more than a successful soldier. Mahmud took large numbers of Indian architects and builders with him to Ghazni and built a fine mosque there, which he called the Celestial Bride. He was very fond of gardens. Of Mathura, Mahmud has given us a glimpse, which shows us what a great city it was. Writing to his governor at Ghazni, Mahmud says, "There are here at Mathura 1,000 edifices as firm as the faith of the faithful. Nor is it likely that this city has attained its present condition but at the expense of many millions of dinars. Nor could such another be constructed under a period of 200 years." This description of Mathura by Mahmud we read in an account given by Firdausi. Firdausi was a great Persian poet who lived in Mahmud's time. I remember mentioning his name and the name of his chief work, the Shahnama, in one of my letters to you last year. There is a story that the Shahnama was written at the request of Mahmud, who promised to pay him a gold dinar, a coin, for every couplet of verses. But Firdausi apparently did not believe in conciseness or brevity. He wrote at tremendous length, and when he produced his many thousands of couplets before Mahmud, he was praised for his work, but Mahmud regretted the rash promise of payment he had made. He tried to pay him something much less, and Firdausi was very angry and refused to accept anything. We have taken a long step from Harsha to Mahmud and surveyed 350 years and more of Indian history in a few paragraphs. I suppose much could be said of this long period, which would be interesting. But I am ignorant of it, and so it is safer for me to preserve a discreet silence. I could tell you something of various kings and rulers who fought each other and sometimes even established large kingdoms in northern India, like the Panchala kingdom, of the trials of the great city of Kannauj, how it was assailed and captured for a while by the rulers of Kashmir, and then by the king of Bengal, and later still by the Rashtrakutas from the south. But this record would serve little purpose and would only confuse you. We have now arrived at the end of a long chapter of Indian history, and a new one begins. It is difficult and often enough wrong to divide up history into compartments. It is like a flowing river. It goes on and on. Still it changes, and sometimes we can see the end of one phase and the beginning of another. Such changes are not sudden. They shade off into each other. So we reach the end of an act in the unending drama of history, as far as India is concerned. What is called the Hindu period is gradually drawing to a close. The Indo-Aryan culture, which had flourished for some thousands of years, has to struggle now against a newcomer. But remember that this change was not sudden. It was a slow process. Islam came to the north with Mahmud. The south was not touched by Islamic conquest for a long time to come, and even Bengal was free from it for nearly 200 years more. In the north, we find Chittor, which was to be so famous in after history for its reckless gallantry, becoming a rallying point for Rajput clans. But surely and inexorably, the tide of Muslim conquest spread, and no amount of individual courage could stop it. There can be no doubt that the old Indo-Aryan India was on the decline. Being unable to check the foreigner and the conqueror, Indo-Aryan culture adopted a defensive attitude. It retired into a shell in its endeavors to protect itself. It made its caste system, which till then had an element of flexibility in it, more rigid and fixed. It reduced the freedom of its womenfolk. Even the village panchayats underwent a slow change for the worse. And yet, even as it declined before a more vigorous people, it sought to influence them and mold them to its own ways. And such was its power of absorption and assimilation that it succeeded in a measure in bringing about the cultural conquest of its conquerors. You must remember that the contest was not between the Indo-Aryan civilization and the highly civilized Arab. The contest was between civilized but decadent India and the semi-civilized and occasionally nomadic people from Central Asia who had themselves recently been converted to Islam. Unhappily, India connected Islam with this lack of civilization and with the horrors of Mahmud's raids, and bitterness grew. Dear friends and students, you were listening to the book Glimpses of World History by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Please subscribe to the channel. Let's meet in the next episode. Thank you for listening.